Good morning, George.
Good morning.
I feel underprepared today. I'm not sure why. I think it's probably because we were so prepared yesterday that we got together a bit later this morning, and it feels like we've done nothing for the show, but it was all prepared yesterday pretty much.
Yeah, we've still got a chocker show.
Yeah, we do have a chocker show. If you joined us yesterday, or if you saw what we were up to yesterday about this rabbit hole we're going down to do with housing and rentals in New Zealand and prices and 30-40% of your income, etc. We're going to continue that conversation today. From the Greens, Ricardo Menéndez March is going to join us. He is their social housing spokesperson. He's also their immigration spokesperson, and I do have a question for him on immigration as well, based around a story I heard yesterday. Someone in Dunedin, I know someone who knows someone, so it's not a personal thing, has been denied residency because their child has Down syndrome. And I'm wondering, in this society we live in, where we're constantly being told by people like the Prime Minister about caring for one another and, a team of 5 million and all that kind of stuff, to have that be a determining factor in denying residency, I'm interested to. It's another rabbit hole, George. Maybe we'll have several of them by the end of next week, and we'll be going down all for the next.
Sounds like something definitely to confirm, because that would definitely be news. If that was the case.
Yeah. Also, coming up any minute now, we're going to have Michael Baker on, Professor Michael Baker from the University of Otago. Is it the University of Otago or Otago University? I never know, George.
University of Otago.
Okay. I'll probably get that. There's my dyslexia kicks in there, and it'll get it wrong the whole time, and then I'll think, it's what will happen in my head is I'll go, it's the opposite of what I think, which means it's Otago University, and then that'll be wrong because it'll be so you can correct me forevermore.
Either or, unless you're writing something. Okay. I would mark a student down for writing Otago University.
Would you? You dick. So obviously big announcement yesterday with the mandates. We took it live. And the commentary has started afterwards. Now, George, I didn't see the end of the press conference. You were watching it while we were talking about it. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure you said this yesterday, that one of the questions that came up from the journalists was, what happens if a school who's allowed to keep the mandates in place decide not to employ someone because they're not vaccinated? And the Prime Minister basically said, I'll have to check into that. Is that a fairly accurate summation of that point that was made?
Yeah, which was surprising. That seems like something you'd sort out. It would be the employer-employee aspect of the mandates.
Yep, and we are having a raft of commentary coming out as well in the last sort of 24 hours about exactly what we talked about yesterday, which is if you give the frontline staff or the frontline businesses or businesses in general the right to either have the mandate or not, what's going to happen to the poor, waitress at the cafe that has to go, we've decided to keep our mandate in place, when they're facing someone who refuses to get or show a mandate. There's a little bit of the offloading. Also interesting to see the commentary that's come out. There is a mixture between experts, and when we talk to Professor Baker, we'll bring some of these up. Some epidemiologists and experts showing some concern around the decision, others saying, yeah, of course. So interested to get Professor Baker's thoughts around that, and around if he thinks, kind of want to go what he thinks of the restriction. To me, it feels like it's a couple of weeks early. And I wonder how much of the decision by the government was driven by good public health measures, and how much of the decision was driven by populism or pressure from things like polls and voters, basically.
There's a heavy reliance on the data, right? That you're saying that on the 5th of April, that peak is going to be, that plateau is going to start, dissipating. That's a heavy reliance on the data. You're guessing the future, right? You're predicting the future, basically. And I know that's what data does, but that seems to be, and I doubt that's how they're making their political decision. They're also calculating in the protests and the general sort of discontent and tiredness with the whole thing. Reaction in my sort of friend group and sort of circle has been pretty much down the middle in terms of too soon or pretty much it is time to
Well, I
ease.
think the problem they're facing, the government's facing, is because they've given it the what is it 2.5 weeks, something like that, 2.5 weeks, nearly 3 weeks lead up. If something turns pear-shaped in that time period, they'll either have to follow public health advice and withdraw the mandate, like the removal of the mandates, and then they will look like utter gooses, and that will be fodder for all of their opposing forces. Or they'll stick by it and make a decision that's based on populism, and that won't be good for the community. I wonder if they had have more waited until the first week of April and said restrictions are off in 2 days. You know what I mean? Like, so waited the time period and then said they're coming off tomorrow, versus saying 3 weeks out they're coming off, as you're saying, George, and then sort of trusting the data or trusting the trusting what the modeling has said. Because even though we did have Dr. Plank, wasn't it, from Christchurch University on the other day, talking about the modeling is not that inaccurate, because I thought we were at the top end of it, and obviously they're very broad spectrum of modeling. It still fits within. You know, if you're out by 20% but still within the modeling factor, that means the peak might be 4 days later, which means the tail might be a bit longer, which means the 4th of April vaccine passes may make a difference. Now, it may not either. It may. We talked to our contributor from the EMA the other day, who said that basically businesses are saying at the moment we are in self-isolation. People who we do have mandate vaccine passes still aren't going out to businesses. Maybe that will continue in that first week of April. Maybe we're mature enough as human beings to see that if the peak is not quite over or there's still a significant tail, we won't just go jumping into every cafe and restaurant and place possible. Maybe, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I just think that in this current climate where we really don't we can't predict what's happening in 3 weeks from now very accurately, to make a decision based on 3 weeks from now is maybe, I mean, they're the experts, I'm not, but it feels a bit naive.
I guess it gives us time to, well, have this debate about leaving it up to businesses. It gives those businesses time to figure out what they're going to do with the mandate. So I was in McDonald's yesterday, and I overheard the staff after their vaccine pass checked me, saying, "Oh, we won't have to do this soon."
So they're pretty happy.
Yeah, they're happy as, that's become a big part of the job for frontline restaurant and retail.
But what happens if their boss, and I think they're in Dunedin, there is one person or family or company that owns, I think there's 3 McDonald's in Dunedin. What happens if he or she decides we're going to keep it in place?
I didn't want to spoil their happiness and be like, "Oh, wait, not too fast." It's really kind of going to be up to your bosses. Which in an ideal world it would be, they'd have a say in that. And I know that McDonald's employees do have, at times fairly strong representation and sort of camaraderie. But yeah, it seems like this 2 weeks, it's been left open for businesses to make their own decision. So, which is it'll be interesting to see who follows through with that, right? What kind of businesses or entities. So again, I'm thinking of the university, or indeed even ministries, government agencies, who follows through with this, with retaining it.
Yeah. Now I've just sent a quick email off to Professor Baker just to see if he's far off. I mean, things happen when you're doing live broadcasting, what you're doing right now, and if that doesn't come together, that's fine. We've got Ricardo Menéndez March from the Greens coming up in the not too distant future. But that's going to be the interesting thing, isn't it? In fact, the first time, it was actually, I think, the day after the vaccine passes came in, we went to a cafe, and one of the people with us didn't have a vaccine pass because they hadn't had their second shot yet. And we said, when I went in, it basically had a picture on the window, or a post on the window that said, to enter these premises, you need to have a vaccine pass. So we sat outside, and because we sat outside, we thought that should be fine. But when they came out to the outside table, remember, this is day one of the mandate of the vaccine passes. They asked for it, and we went, this person here doesn't have one, but we thought we could sit outside, it'll be fine. And the waitress immediately went, "Oh, look, it's fine. Don't worry about it. I wish I didn't have to check them anyway." So that was on day one. On day one, she was saying, "I wish I didn't have to check them." So, yeah, I imagine for some of those people who haven't been wanting to do it at all, then, yeah, then to be told by their owner or boss, "We're going to keep it in place," it will be a nightmare. Just speaking of what we just said about, Tigers just asked, have noticed of social media that a lot of the antis seem to be coding this as their victory, as it was due to their efforts. Thoughts? No, of course not. Of course not. I think if we're incredibly generous, and I mean incredibly generous, maybe we could say that some of the pressure that they applied brought it forward a little bit, because I still thought maybe a couple of weeks longer would have made more sense, but certainly not the cancelling of mandates. In fact, I think, we could probably go back and have a look this up. I think probably from week one, the government itself, the bodies, the health experts were saying, we don't want these in place forever. There will be a time they will come off. So if you're saying that on week one, if you're saying that 3, 4, 5, 6 months before protests happen, then of course you're not the reason they're coming off. However, it's undeniable that an underdwelling, that's not the right word, an under vibe, coming underneath. That'll do. Undercurrent, thank you, sir. An undercurrent of discontent has grown, and that in part can have a look squarely at people who are protesting, etc. Because they've created enough noise. When you create enough noise or throw enough mud, some will stick.
It's definitely factored into the political decision for sure. But I imagine that, so the protest in Wellington definitely was like, the tip of the iceberg. Maybe we could see it as the tip of the iceberg, as for what Pat said, as a more latent undercurrent of discontent in the country, or even just like COVID fatigue, and this sort of thing. And they will sort of coat it as their victory, see this as their victory, and good on them. But as I've said before, I'm sure they'll find something else to the hardliners, at least. A lot of them will go home, but I'm sure that there's something else, because their movement in the first place wasn't specific anyway. It didn't really, maybe some of the figureheads that were a bit more articulate could talk about the mandates, but it was larger than that, right? It was more diffuse. It was more nebulous than that, and so the protest movement, in a way, will continue to sort of represent this undercurrent.
Well, look, and you'll never convince me from watching it, and I was watching it for hours a day. People don't know my studio, but my studio is set up that within a meter that way, I have a 50-inch monitor, and 3 meters that way, I have another 50-inch monitor. The protest was on that monitor a meter away from me every minute I was down here in the studio when I was working that whole week. So I watched a lot of it. And you are not going to convince me. There is nothing you can do or say to convince me that was primarily an anti-mandate protest. It was primarily an anti-vaccine protest, couched as an anti-mandate. So to George's point, the anti-vaccine conversation still goes on, even if the mandates have been lifted. So I think many of those people will continue. I think counter-spin media will still be asking people to supply them vans full of media equipment to fight the good fight, even though the mandates have been lifted. So, look, I mean, every chance now we're not going to get Michael Baker, which happens. This is live broadcast, but what I thought we'd do is, this was one of the things we were going to use with Professor Baker, was talk about what some of the other experts are saying, and there is differing in opinions. University of Canterbury Professor Michael Planck said the vaccine passes were redundant, giving the increasing level of infection of the Omicron variant across New Zealand, allowing unvaccinated people into places like cafes and bars doesn't substantially alter the risk of catching COVID there. There are likely to be lots of COVID positive people there either way. So that's Professor Planck's position on this. And there's the beautiful man who we had on last week about modeling. Was that what we had Professor Plank on? We had him on for modeling, didn't we? I think that's right.
I can double check.
Yeah, I think that's what we had him on for. However, COVID-19 modeling Aotearoa Dr. Emily Harvey said to reduce Omicron's transmission, the red and orange settings should be strengthened with indoor gathering limits cut to 25 people. She says, quote, allowing event sizes of up to 200 people with no ventilation or air quality requirements is going to increase the potential risks. Overseas, in fact, while I'm doing this, George, can you find me something? Can you find me the Greens' response to the announcement yesterday? Because the Greens came out and said quite strongly, like if you just get on their Facebook page or something, quite strongly that they thought that it was a bad idea. When Ricardo comes on, we'll ask him about that as well. Right, I'll continue with Dr. Harvey's comments. She says, overseas we have seen numerous super shredder events where close to 100% of the large numbers of attendees became infected when the environment was indoor, crowded and poorly ventilated, including bars, nightclubs, Christmas parties, at restaurants and birthday parties. Thankfully, the New Zealand public have been making their own risk assessments, says Harvey, which kind of echoes what actually our EMA contributor said during the week. Getting takeaways, meeting up outdoors, and not having lots of 100-person indoor gatherings. This has been making a big impact on reducing the spread of infections. So think about that. That's commentary on us and what we're doing as a positive about how we've reduced the increase of infections, and just think how bad the infections have been. So if 20,000 a day is a good reduction of infections, imagine if we hadn't done well, what the number could have been.
I've got an example here of the Green Party's reaction to this.
Yep.
Right, yeah, so they've got the graphic here. Now is not the time. The pandemic is far from over. Also, just from a political point of view, I feel like this is they've struck a balance here where they've sort of like provided ideas that could still take place within the framework that the Labor government has put forth, like free N95 masks, for example.
Yeah.
Which is always good to see. So yeah, there's the Green Party thing. Obviously, worrying about immunocompromised people, which is most of the people I saw in my sort of circles against the changes were sort of talking about that and disabled people and that sort of thing. Young whānau.
And coming up shortly, we are going to have a Green MP with us. We'll ask. They're not here to talk about COVID. They're here to talk about housing. But we will ask them about that. And also, before I just go on to say the response that Susie Wiles gave to the decision yesterday, we have someone coming up around the 11:30 mark, who is a person who's lived in New Zealand for most of their life, 33 out of 41 years, but who was born in Ukraine and who has been escorted, the article says, by some former New Zealand Defence Force men, employees, people, back to Ukraine to do what? The story is written like they're going to fight, but we'll get the full story from them when they come on.
Yeah, this is good because we're going to be able to clarify some of the things that were reported and stuff.
Yeah, and also just finally, let's have a look at what Dr. Susie Wiles said of the decision yesterday. University of Auckland Associate Professor Susie Wiles was, quote, very nervous to see the vaccination mandate for education workers, including teachers, drop from April 5th. Removing vaccine passes for people working with our children who can't yet be vaccinated makes me nervous. She said the evidence from overseas was, quote, really clear. Those countries that have dropped restrictions as their Omicron wave was subsiding are now experiencing another wave. I guess the question would be to Susie and to anyone who, if we had Professor Baker on, we would have asked him, is the other wave they're experiencing BA2? Because it would make sense if there is a second variant of Omicron come into the community, that there'd be a second wave from it. And we've been saying since day one is uneducated, ill-educated, undereducated people in Omicron, that to me it feels a little bit like one of the reasons we're table topping a bit versus perhaps getting a hard spike was when we went up the slope, so to speak, we had BA1 and then BA2 hit. No wonder if that extended it on. So what I want to know from what Susie has said is the wave they're experiencing now because of BA2, or is it because 5% of the teachers going back are unvaccinated. We don't know the answer to that, but that's why we like to have people on to pose the questions to the brainy people, not us. Right. So 10, 15 minutes away, we're going to be having a chat to a New Zealander, a Ukrainian-born New Zealander who is heading back to Ukraine to do what? We're not sure. The story is painted as if he is going back to fight, but is that the case, or does he just want to go back to talk to family and get close in a dangerous time? We'll get all that in the next 10, 15 minutes. But right now, we want to welcome to the show the social housing spokesperson for the Greens, Ricardo Menéndez March. Ricardo, good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Kia ora.
It's very nice to see your face today. Nice to talk to you yesterday briefly, and thank you for giving us a little bit of time today.
All good. It's nice to be here with you too.
The big question, I guess, before we start is, and I know it was a bit long-winded and it was more than 10 minutes, which I said to you yesterday. Did you manage to see the clip we had yesterday that we talked about when we started to pose the questions of this housing crisis? What is it? What's going on?
Yeah, no, it was fascinating watching Chris Luxon grapple with Ryan Bridge in terms of defining affordability, and also, I guess, like tangibly talking about the solutions that people would want around rents. And what, to me, it really shows is that if there's no willingness to have real intervention in the market and to clamp down on how much rent landlords can charge, we're not going to see those results. So it's really telling that the National is entering with this sort of vague proposals that ultimately do nothing to curtail the powers of landlords.
Yeah, I guess from an outside looking in, I think one of the, and I'll say jobs, I don't know if that's the right word, but one of the things that oppositional parties do is they throw out big statements because they don't need to prove themselves. But when you're criticizing quite specifically a number, i.e. rents have increased by $50, for people who don't know, this is what Chris Luxon said yesterday morning on the AM show. I think it's appropriate for media to say, well, if you say $50 increase is too much, how much are you going to reduce it by? And I think most of us skeptics who aren't involved in the halls of power, Ricardo, go, when have we ever seen a price decrease when it comes to rent? What landlords have ever decreased their prices because they've got more money in their pockets rather than just put more money in their pockets? So it feels like a little bit of someone's just playing games. He's playing games and he's playing games that way. But the point that we wanted to start to investigate was this whole idea around what should we be paying for rent in a fair and equitable community, and what are we paying in rent? And you saw the clip yesterday. And for people who didn't, at one stage, Christopher Luxon mentioned 40% of income would be fair, which is incredibly high on a world stage. It's too high, in fact. But we're unclear whether what the measurement should be or is around the world is 40% of your wage or 40% of the household income, because those are two very different questions as to what has then become fair for housing. Can you help us out with some of those ponderings?
Yeah, I mean, I think just starting, I really disagree with the sort of opposition framing that their role is just to oppose for the sake of opposing and then just throwing some random statements, right? I think that's actually what's making politics really toxic, that we should be, the Greens are effectively, for all sense and purposes, in opposition. And I see our role actually as proposing tangible solutions. In terms of the ratio of income to rents, what we've been clear is that we should be legislating so that people pay no more than 30% of their individual income into rent.
So the Greens, the Greens are saying no more than 30% of your individual. So the average wage at the moment in New Zealand is $58,000. So on average, obviously there's many people who are far worse off than that, and there are many people who are better off than that. But on average, 30% on that would be what you guys are advocating for the average earner to pay in rent.
Yeah, and I mean, what we do have already are, I mean, the thing is, we kind of have a section of the population who are protected by income-related rents, right? So it's not like we don't have any sort of measures that can guarantee this. And I mean, state housing tenants are protected by measures that gives them that certainty. The issue is that over the decades, we've kind of chipped away the eligibility criteria for people to qualify for this subsidy that guarantees people to have affordable rents. And in many places in the world, actually the eligibility for such types of subsidies is way higher. And then in places like Vienna, which has a really strong public housing program, it's quite common for people to live in public housing where they're protected by paying only a proportion of their income into rent. So for us, part of getting there is implementing rent controls, and it's about expanding the eligibility of public housing. Less so kind of hoping that landlords will benevolently just choose to arbitrarily like lower their rents, which, as you've mentioned, it
is unlikely.
It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I mean, we can't leave it to the market to sort of regulate itself and have reasonable rents.
I'm sorry to be a mathematician here, but this is the information that I think I need. And I don't know if the clip you saw yesterday was included this, but part of my desire to understand these sorts of things well is we used to have, and if you've seen this, I'm just repeating myself, but people who didn't see the clip yesterday, is to have accuracy on what the data says. So when I was working as a talkback host, there used to be data in the media a lot about, there used to be headlines in the media, not data, about how, foreign nationals are sending the price of houses through the roof, But when the data came out, it was 1.5% or less of house sales are being bought by foreign nationals. And to me, it screamed of racial undertones, because especially in Auckland, there was a lot of people of Asian ancestry buying houses. And so what the racial undertones were, I see Asians buying houses, they're foreign nationals, rather than these people live and work and breed in New Zealand. So I think the data was giving the wrong impression as to why. And I think the last 2 years of no migrants and house prices going through the roof is evident that it's not necessarily migration that's under. So what I want, but I want some clarity here. As you said, 30% of one's income, is that gross or net? Because that also makes a difference. Because 30% of 58 is 17,000. 30% of gross is going to be, a third less than that. What do the Greens say?
That's a good question. I'm open. I mean, I would say that ideally we should be aiming for net, but I believe the way that income-related rent subsidies would likely be calculated, for example, is gross. And so, I think, look, in my view, what we should be aiming to is to have rents as low as possible. Again, this is why public housing, to me, is the most ideal solution. In terms of other ways to curtail that, is to have rent controls where, if in terms of the numbers, what we would be looking to see is things like setting a limit to how much you can increase rents by, set by no higher than basically like wage growth or inflation growth, minus 1%. So what this guarantees is that what we are seeing is wages going up, ideally at an equal or faster rate than rent increases. So that's one way of getting there. And by kind of having rent freezes and rent controls at the same time, like, we are actually realistically able to get there. What we did during the pandemic is we had rent freezes, but we didn't put rent controls, right? So what happens is once you end the rent freezes, we just see a spike in rents and
a double increase.
Yeah, and so this is kind of why we need both, not either. So I think, to me, this is why rent controls plus rent freezes is really key to having like a sensible way of getting incomes to catch up with rents, and not kind of look at it in isolation. And again, I think what the rent freeze has shown is that if we just leave it to the goodwill of landlords and to this idea that tenants can just go to the tenancy tribunal and challenge increases in rents if they're above sort of like the market rate. I mean, we know that process is really messy, and like, people shouldn't be expected to go through some messy judicial process to kind of to get an outcome, right? So I think we do need like legislation to curtail rent increases to get there.
And why the tenancy tribunal doesn't work is it's also got a massively long backlog of work. So even if you have been increased your rent, or you've been turfed out of your house or whatever, you've still probably got to find 2, 3, 4, 5 months worth of accommodation or costings before your case can even get seen from time to time. So it doesn't actually solve the immediate problem of some of these things that are happening. When you talk about social housing, I'd like some clarity around that, because I think about social housing as in sort of state housing. People live in state housing in New Zealand at the moment, and they pay whatever it is, 10, you see some people, because they're on a very low income or a benefit, paying, you know, $100 or $200 for a house that market rate might be $400 or $500 because that's compared to their income. Social housing
not
for
a bad
me,
thing, right? I mean,
no,
like,
no, no,
that's the
no,
thing.
no,
Yeah,
no, no, no.
like-
It's not a criticism, but I'm also thinking of the practicality of it and the logistics of it. If that's going to be a solution to our renting problem, don't we need 50,000 more houses that are social, you know, that are social housing? Because those, as far as I understand, are basically all kind of full up at the moment, or they're close to being full up. So there are a huge number of people. I think we saw yesterday 17% of the population at the moment is already paying over 40%. And correct me if I'm wrong here with this, George, but something like 37% are already paying over 30%. So if you think about 37 and you might have 50% of the population already paying over 30%. If social housing is the answer, that's a huge proportion of people that need help. And I don't think you or I think we'll agree that you can't provide that many people, that many social houses to solve it. So there's got to be other things as well.
Well, I mean, I would argue against that. I think part of the problem with this government's approach, which is kind of following what National was doing, is that how they're doing developments at the moment. So, for example, if you take places like Mangere, 2/3 of the housing that they are doing, it's still private housing. So we are not prioritizing building enough public housing. Labour can talk all they want about how they're building more state homes than National, which was a really low bar considering National was selling them off. But I think the truth is that we could be building far more public housing and therefore working towards increasing the eligibility criteria, which we've been chipping away at. So, I mean, again, this is one of the levers we should be pushing on top of things like rent controls. The other great thing about public housing is that in places around the world where you see substantive building of public housing, house prices do tend to decrease. And this is why, for example, in my select committee in Parliament, like I've seen petitions of people trying to stop state housing developments because there's like, you know, property developers and investors are so worried about how, you know, effectively it's going to ghettoize their community, but that's code for house prices decreasing. And so part of what we've been saying in the select committee and when the housing ministers come is, look, you should be tweaking that ratio of private versus state house that you're building, because the private market homes that the government is building, they're not even within reach for most working class people. I mean, and so like if you're going to be doing government interventions, make it public housing so that you home those people on the waiting list, work towards increasing the eligibility criteria, and guarantee that more people will not pay more than 30% of their income and rents.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm always critical of political parties who talk about, you know, we're going to build more houses, etc. We're going to, you know, 10,000 Kiwi build, because I'm like, well, so where are those builders coming from? You know, where are those people coming from? I already know that I have to wait 6 months to get a builder to come look at a bathroom reno, and all of a sudden we're going to pull 10,000 houses out our ass. So I'm always wary with the idea of we're just going to build more houses. But look, we're going to move on, Ricardo, and we're going to continue this conversation. But before we do, I just want to ask you one other question, completely aside to it. And we're going to have Michael Baker coming up next for people who were talking about a bit earlier on for a quick chat. Is two quick questions. The first one was the Greens' response to the decision yesterday. George, can you bring up that screenshot that we showed earlier, where there was a very strong response, basically saying now is not the time to pull mandates on? What is the thoughts behind that from the Greens?
Yeah, I mean, our approach has been one where we say, look, COVID is by no means over. The reality is that our peak, for example, in the South Island hasn't even arrived. And so right now is not the time, as the graphics that you just pulled up says, to wind down restrictions. I think a lot of people are feeling really worn down by the pandemic, and that's totally fair enough. But the answer is to provide support for free N95s, better income support so that people are better supported, and more support for students in schools. Not go down the route of like Australia and other countries that have seen, you know, massive amounts of death. We are very protected by our high vaccination rates and the quality of the vaccines. Yep. But it doesn't mean that COVID has gone away and that it does not pose a risk for a mass disabling event for many. So more support directly for people, cash in hand payments, free 95s masks, instead of just loosening restrictions all around.
The last thing, you talked to me yesterday when we had a chat on the phone about being involved with immigration for the Greens. We do have to move on. I've got already two people queued up who want to talk to us next. So I apologize for rushing this question. But I know of a case in Dunedin where a family is being denied residency because their child, well, I can't say because it's the only reason, but one of the reasons is their child is Down syndrome. And I thought, living in a country where we're being told we're a team of 5 million, that we're supposed to look after our neighbor, that we're a caring, sharing community, is this something that's fairly common? And although I'm not asking you for, advice from an MP to this particular family, what does that happen, and what kind of family do? Because that sounds disgusting to me.
I've been working very closely on that case. It's absolute bullcrap that we have a policy that basically exempts migrants being protected by their human rights. We've signed up to conventions protecting the rights of disabled people, and the government just tramples all over it. So people shouldn't be discriminated because they're disabled. People can do appeals, but again, they're very lengthy. So we are working towards scrapping that policy that means those kind of families face barriers.
Hey, Ricardo, thanks for joining us. I very, very much appreciated talking to you today. There's a bunch of messages that have come in as well, but because we've kind of been squashed a bit into the second half of the show, we'll leave those comments. If you've sent us a comment, we'll probably put it up at the end of the show. But Ricardo, thanks for joining us. We'll definitely have you guys back on again, and hopefully we'll have some clarity around what's happening with housing as we get towards a new election. All right. I have to take a pause here, guys, because we've got another guest coming up shortly who is due to come up now, but we're on the internet, George. We're on the internet. We don't need to rush. We've got no ad breaks to hit. We don't have to go and go, news coming at the top of the hour. We can just take a breath.
That was actually quite good because we had heaps of potential guests just lined up at the bottom.
I know, that was cool way. So you've spoken to, before we go to Michael, you've spoken to Anton. He's called to wait a few minutes before we come back on.
Yeah, we might have to do Anton another day. He's in Northland, relying on cell phones and that sort of thing. So I think what we'll do is definitely try and get him in another day because his story is fascinating. So
all right, or maybe we could. Okay. So I'll leave you to work on that right now because I think we are going to bring on board from the University of Otago. Is that right? University of Otago University. Professor Michael Baker. Michael, good morning to you.
Yeah, kia ora, Pat.
Kia ora. Ignore any of those emails that went backwards and forwards that went, we missed a window, maybe we'll do it tomorrow. So we're here now and we're talking, and as I just said, I saw you smiling and laughing as I was talking, going, this is the internet. We don't have an ad break to hit. We can just take a breath. We don't have to rush. As long as you're okay for a bit of a chat, we don't have to rush.
Yeah, no, it's always good to talk.
The big announcement yesterday about the mandates coming off April 5th, pretty much, basically. Really keen to get your thoughts on that decision.
Yeah, well, I think some of this was an inevitable change, and we know that there's a lot of pressure to adjust our response in relation to the fact that the Omicron variant is obviously less severe than the Delta variant. We are highly vaccinated now, and I think obviously there's a degree of fatigue and even resistance to the response after 2 years. And it is very harsh, as we know, for some groups, some sectors, hospitality, tourism, and so on. It's always important to remember, though, that even if New Zealand changes its settings, it doesn't transport us back magically to the pre-pandemic era. A lot of the problems are global problems now, and we can't sort of magically return to that environment. The other thing is that many people also respond to the level of threat as they perceive it. And this is in terms of going back out to hospitality venues and so on. Yeah. And the other reality is that actually the risk of getting this virus has never been higher than it is at the moment in New Zealand. I mean, transmission, particularly in the South Island, as you know, is just increasing at the moment, or I think it's actually really peaking, whereas it peaked in Auckland a couple of weeks ago. So there's a lot of virus in New Zealand, and many people will be, taking precautions against getting infected.
Yeah, maybe, George, if you can hear me, maybe we'll put some of the data up. But I was surprised. I think I read in the New Zealand Herald this morning, I was surprised at the number of cases in southern DHB versus what was around the rest of the country. Southern DHB, of course, for people who aren't aware, are sort of Oamaru across to Queenstown, down Dunedin, Invercargill, that sort of area. And it really surprised me. I think maybe Auckland still had more, but comparative population, it looked like perhaps Southern at the moment is the per capita, maybe one of the hardest hit areas for new infections. Am I reading that data correctly?
Yeah, and one of the things is, of course, we get bombarded with numbers, but actually, as an epidemiologist, you're always more concerned about rates because that's a measure of risk. So the population, Auckland always looks dominant because, there's 1.6 million people there, and of course they'll have lots of cases, but their rate now, their case numbers are falling, but also their rate is now much less than the South Island.
Yeah. So and that's important, isn't it? It's a little bit like when we hear the opposing forces, Michael, the dark side, come out talking about, there's more people with the vaccine who are in hospital than without. But when you go, but 96% of the people in hospital making up, 50% of the cases, or even 60% of the cases, whereas 3% of the population making up 30% of the cases. But the number per capita of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, it says to me as an idiot sitting in Dunedin that the vaccinated status is still by far and away the safest status for both infection and hospitalization.
Yeah, look, we're in such a good position having these tools. They make an enormous difference. I would say at the moment there's two gaps in vaccination that concern me. One is that we've got almost 1 million New Zealanders who haven't had a booster. And at the very least, a booster saves you from getting a really miserable illness. I don't know if you've talked to people who've got this infection or had it recently. Some of them say it is really the sickest they've ever felt. They haven't quite gone to hospital, but you want to avoid this. And considering how quick and easy it is to do that, I'm still amazed that not everyone is taking advantage of this free vaccine. The other gap I'm worried about is that only about half of our school-age kids have been vaccinated.
Right.
And that worries me because of long COVID particularly. I mean, young kids their immune systems are tough, and they will generally do very well with this infection. They do go to hospital sometimes, they very rarely die. But there is the problem of long COVID. We don't think that age protects you from this. This is obviously the long tail of infection that affects many body systems, the brain, the heart, and other systems. And you really don't want to get this chronic fatigue type syndrome. And it is very avoidable because the good news is that the evidence shows that vaccination protects you from this very well. So it's just another good reason to get vaccinated. And I'm, again, very surprised that all parents aren't rushing off to vaccinate their kids. And this is only my own personal experience. I've still got an 11-year-old at home who fortunately loved the idea of getting vaccinated, was begging to get vaccinated, and has had a second shot now. But she is saying that, some of her friends at school haven't been vaccinated. And I'm just really concerned for their well-being. And we have made sure that she goes off to school every day with a high-performing N95 style mask.
Yep.
But the standards in schools are not great. I mean, these masks cost more, and most of the kids are running around with little disposable surgical masks or fabric masks, which are really not good enough now with Omicron.
Yeah. I've got a beautiful kind of creative brain, Michael. And when people are talking, I start to, not that I drift away from the conversation, but I start to think about where that could go. And as you were talking about the peaks and about where we're at, I had this picture in my head of the protests at Wellington and the people that were there. You're in Wellington. And I just wondered if you were on Wellington grounds during that protest. And that prompted me to think, how are you doing at the moment? Have you had any instances where you felt unsafe? How have you been because obviously you're one of the faces of this, and there is, what I would think to be a ridiculous pushback at the moment from unscientific, conspiracy theorists. But how have you been during this? Have you been in any situations where you've kind of felt unsafe physically or anything?
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't felt really endangered, but the pushback on social media, some of it is really disturbing. And there is a disinformation project where academics are tracking some of the information that appears on various platforms. And some of it is really horrible. And basically, it's there's degrees of awfulness, but some of it basically dehumanizes you. Some of it then talks about performing violent acts on you. It doesn't quite get to the stage of saying what, when, and where, like organizing something, but it's every step up to that. And I know I'm not alone in this regard. And so that is regularly monitored, and it's the people doing the monitoring report every day to the police about the contents. And of course, Telegram is one of the main sites where a lot of these groups are hosted, because it's an unmoderated website. It's interesting. It was started by a couple of Russians a few years ago. You probably know the background to it, but it's interesting to see that for the Ukraine struggle, it's one of the main sites they're using to get information out. So I guess it's just like the internet in some ways is this is a particular platform that's relatively agnostic about content. But in New Zealand, it is hosting, far right, neo-Nazis, and anti-vaccine groups, Voices for Freedom, and all the rest that produce absolute streams of what I would say is complete rubbish and disinformation, misinformation. A lot of it's generated by commercial interests, the natural foods industry or natural remedies industry internationally, that's trying to drive people away from science-based approaches to say, go more with your feeling and go more with, don't ignore the science, basically follow us. And so it's got a big commercial drivers as well. But I think it's unfortunately, some of the consequences are, I think, have been very rough for vulnerable people.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, we've got people watching live at the moment. There are a couple of people who have asked a few questions, and I like some of their questions. Are we okay to? I've got a couple more for you, but the reason I'm asking is if you're okay to take a couple of questions from people watching, then what I'll say to people is, if you're watching and you want to ask Professor Michael Baker a question, put it in the comments. Obviously, all my viewers are respectful, Michael. That'll be fine. They're all love. I have no cocks watching this. They're all lovely people. But if you want to ask Professor Baker a question, and I think it either hasn't been asked or it's worth asking, then chuck it in the comments. Couple of things. The announcement that was made yesterday about the vaccine passes, there has been a response from academics and learned people kind of across the board. We talked about this a bit earlier this morning. Professor Michael Plank at Christchurch said basically it sounds like it's time. One of the modelers, who was Dr. Emily Harvey, was concerned about the inside numbers going up, and Dr. Susie Wiles says removing vaccine mandates for people working with our children who can't yet be vaccinated makes me nervous. Susie went on to say that places internationally, I'm paraphrasing, who reduced the vaccine mandates too soon are experiencing another wave. The first thing I wanted to ask you is, do you think that the decision that was made yesterday is more driven by public health advice or public pressure and populism? And because I thought it was perhaps a couple of weeks too early, but I'd be interested to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with those concerns, and I've done a few interviews where I've talked about the problems. I mean, one thing is that I think obviously the timing is wrong. I mean, the time to relax anything is when you've well out of the intense pandemic wave, where some of the changes are happening from this Friday, when virus transmission's never really been higher in New Zealand. So I think that's a bad decision, and I think it must be partly driven by politics. Whereas if we wait till, I would say, May, we would see the country coming out of its pandemic wave and settling at this new, fairly high baseline level. The second thing is, I think some of the controls aren't, we need criteria-based approaches here. So the controls need to be based on best evidence. So we should only be doing things that actually work. Secondly, I think they need to be proportionate to the problem they're trying to fix. And so that would mean that some tools, I think, could be retired but kept in our back pocket. The obvious one is QR scanning to support contact tracing. We're just not using it. So we shouldn't burden people with this. And but keep the app on your phone in case we need it in the future. The other, I'm really concerned about vaccine passes, because these are no longer particularly effective And the reason is that they needed to be adjusted for, I mean, they were developed for Delta. 2 doses of vaccine worked very well. Omicron, we know we need 3. There are technical problems of updating this because of the way the passes are issued. But that tool really needed to be updated. And I think it still had a role in some settings. The setting that worries me most is a whole bunch of people. We all love going out socializing. You're indoors, even with up to 100 people. And if food and drink is served, of course, you take your mask off.
Sure.
And if you just got your vaccine pass, well, you still can be very easily infected with Omicron and infect everyone around you. So I just felt that the tools were not really working very well for their intended purpose. And I think that was something that could have been fixed. So in a way, removing those requirements will have not a huge impact because most people are vaccinated now. And it really needed to have the next step up of requiring a booster. So it's a mixed bag, really, at the moment.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying, and not that we have to get into this because we've got one other question, then a few questions coming in from people, is maybe I'm just going to bring up a page of search engines of the vaccine pass. Maybe if you had to get boosted, that vaccine pass, which is grey, would have been green or something. So it would have even given more. Is that sort of what you're saying? There could have been a better way to identify vaccinated people from boosted people?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I said that at the start. I thought that was interesting. On the boosted, you were talking about being protected, after the boost. I saw a Facebook post. Sorry, I know it's the scientific take from Facebook, but I saw a Facebook post the other day from a colleague of mine who said something like they'd gotten their 4th booster or their 4th shot. And I follow this obviously super closely. And I thought, what? Even I, someone who follows it quite closely is like, hang on, what? 4th booster or 4th shot? What's because we're talking about being boosted to protect you. Is there advice coming out now, or is there a bit of a swing towards boosting again?
Yeah, well, some people are already having their 4th dose anyway, and that's and in fact the terminology starts to get a bit confusing because quite early on, people who had immune suppressive illness were advised to get a 3rd dose and then get their booster as well, and that was because the immune system, I mean, after all, the vaccine doesn't give you immunity on its own. It stimulates your immune system to give you immunity. So if your immune system is impaired for various reasons, and partly increasing age, so immune senescence, but also underlying illness, you won't get a great response. And so you may need to give that response everything you can to stimulate it. So that's quite common now, and that some people have had a 4th dose. And whether you call that a boost or just reboosting your system, the terminology is a bit ambiguous.
Okay. Look, I know you've been with us for much longer than you said you were going to be because we had a bit of a later start. Are you okay for a couple more minutes, or do you need to go? Because we could wrap it now. You're okay?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to just a couple of these questions then. Crazy Old World says, Michael, where, and this was sort of one of my questions that was going to be as well, but where do you see New Zealand being in 12 months' time?
Yeah, well, the unpredictable or the wild card in all of this is the virus, as we know. And there's 2 ways it evolves. One is by sort of, you say, drift. The virus drifts along, and in general, it gradually improves what it does, which is just become more transmissible or better at evading the immune system. But then occasionally it's capable of what's called shift, where it has a dramatic change. And this is where you get a process where it can pick up a whole lot of RNA from a different virus. And that's when you get a Delta or an Omicron or another Greek letter appears. And the way the virus will beat its successors in the evolutionary arms race is by evading our immunity. So we need to plan for what could be a big shift. This may produce a virus that's more or less dangerous. That's not certain. So that's the big unknown. Now, if that doesn't happen, and Omicron, after all, is a very fit virus. It's very infectious. It's going to beat off all comers at the moment. If that's still the virus we're dealing with, then I think we'll be in a reasonably good situation. We will be working out more about what immunization schedule is useful. I think probably we should bargain on maybe an annual COVID-19 jab along with our flu vaccine, which is still very important.
Yep.
And we will be better able to manage the most vulnerable in New Zealand. That's my big hope, and life will be getting back to a much closer resemblance to normal at that point.
Okay. Gareth also says rat tests seem to be hit and miss, almost completely unreliable according to some. Michael's thoughts. Got any thoughts around that about rat tests and how accurate they are, Michael?
Yeah. Well, they are quite limited. I mean, they're not perfect tests, as I think everyone knows. I mean, the thing is, there's because they're often self-administered. Not all of us are very used to poking a swab up our noses and even pointing it in the right spot. And so that's a big problem. And they're less reliable or less valid or sensitive when they're self-administered. So one thing is to maybe get someone else to actually do the swabbing for you, and really following the instructions, poking it into your nose rather than up your nose, among other things. Follow the instructions. The other thing is the sensitivity is quite low early in illness, so you often need to test yourself 2 or 3 times, and maybe at 2-day intervals when you're getting symptoms. That improves the sensitivity. If you're really still sick and you really want to know, you can still go and get a PCR test.
Right. Oh, that's a good idea. So if you're unconvinced of your results, go and get a PCR. That would be the advice. Nathan says, now I don't know the person, Dr. Paul Offit, but maybe you do. Hi, Michael. Do you agree with Dr. Paul Offit that natural infection should count as 1 dose of vaccine? So I guess for other people watching, what he's saying is when you get an infection and you get over it, you have the antibodies. Although, let's be clear, I've heard people talk about immunity because I've got it. Your antibodies still wane between 3 and 6 months. So is what he's saying, with that waning, much like the vaccine wanes, could it be counted as 1 dose of vaccine?
Yeah, look, I think that's probably a reasonable metaphor. I mean, people talk about hybrid immunity being quite good. That's a combination of getting vaccinated and then encountering the virus, which a lot of people will experience. And now people, particularly those who are boosted, may get the virus and may feel a little bit unwell and then bounce back. And it may be because they have actually been exposed to it. There's evidence that kind of hybrid immunity is probably quite strong. We still don't know. I mean, antibody immunity does wane, but other forms of immunity, particularly the cell-based cellular immunity, does appear to be more long-lived.
Yeah. And
it will be years before we know fully, because it's just a new virus, and the vaccines are relatively new, and everything we're doing it's a new territory. So anything that relates to long-term questions inevitably will take time to answer those questions.
Very good. Hey, look, Michael, thank you for giving us some extra time this morning. I know that the start, we didn't quite connect at the start, but you were gracious enough to stick with us through the second part of the show. So we appreciate that. Got to answer some of the people's questions directly. And yeah, I'm sure we'll talk to you again sometime soon, but thank you for giving us some time today. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, great to talk, Pat. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. That's Professor Michael Baker from the University of Otago. Or is it Otago University? I'm already doing it, George.
Just think of what would be the more sort of formal, special, grand title, right?
University of Otago.
Yeah.
All right, there you go.
It's got more words, so therefore it's more important and formal.
Is it the same? Because is it Canterbury University or University of Canterbury then? It might be Canterbury University. I don't know. Anyway, let's get on to other things. I was just having a look, maybe, and look, I'm sorry for people who are watching who put comments in at various times, but you'll appreciate Michael Baker was going to come on at 11:05. He got held up, and so our 11:15 conversation turned into something else, which all got a bit pressured. So I wasn't going to add more time delay with those comments then, but I'm happy to share some of them now, even though they're stuff we have already talked about. Nathan says, unfortunately, the current government are terrible at building new homes to increase supply and are also in the housing market competing with everyday New Zealanders. Nathan goes on to talk about renting to own would be a great scheme. I think that's right. Actually, I wrote a piece, it might be nearly 20 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, talking about how to get around some of these issues. And one of the biggest things we need to do as a community is build wealth. It's one of the things, and one of the ways that New Zealanders build wealth is by owning a home and getting, that capital gain. And if rather than the government providing housing and basically renting it to people, if they built housing and sold it to people, that would solve the problem of the person needing a house. But then if they even only paid what they would be paying in a, based on their salary way, they're also owning the house and building equity in it, i.e. having more capital behind them. And that's one of the driving factors between positive outcomes in life, is not being on the bottom rung of society when it comes to things like income and assets and that kind of stuff as well. So I very much like the idea of rent to own, and I like the idea of it being done through the government personally. George, anything?
I mean, would that get us to a point? Like I'm a radical. Housing is a human right. I think and housing costs should be 0% of your household income, right? But would that get us to a place where we can, say that we actually own the houses rather than the banks owning the houses? Would that sort of solve that issue?
I guess doing it through but if doing it, I'm literally talking about the government providing the income for that, not the banks.
Yeah.
And if it was a low income, if it was let's just say it was someone who could and would be normally in a Housing New Zealand house, right?
Yeah.
So that's a house that's provided by the government with a very small amount of rent being paid on it. If that was the same plan, but rather than that being rent, it was going towards the mortgage, which could be a 0% mortgage because it's provided by the government, then every cent they put into it is building capital in the house. And then there's also the capital gain. So the house that they get into is worth $500,000. And then over the next 10 years, it's worth $1 million. So just living in that house and paying it off, they've earned $500,000 in capital gain, and also whatever they've paid off the mortgage as well.
Let's do it.
But you said something interesting, and this is a debate for another day. You said that housing is a human right. Of course, then the question comes back to what is housing? Because a tent is housing, a caravan is housing, a shed is housing. So, and I've done a debate with my Elephant TV debate show where we did this exact conversation with Julianne Genter, actually, from the Greens, because one of their policies is affordable quality housing is a right. And so one of the questions is, what if it's affordable but not quality? Or what if it's quality but not affordable? What if it's a caravan but it's worth $150,000? So not to kind of beat down the point saying there is no point, but I guess the saying is the devil's always in the details,
And obviously you'd need standards to enforce what quality is. I mean, I'm in an affordable house that isn't of quality. One of the room I'm in currently, which is our sort of spare room studio, would be completely unlivable in winter. It has something structurally wrong with it where it's very damp and moldy. And so that would be you'd hope that that's illegal, but
So what I hear you saying is you're drawing a line in the sand that says if we don't provide you a better studio by winter, you're gone. Are you handing in your resignation? Are you? Is that what it is?
I'll be in here. I just wouldn't want to sleep in here.
You'd have a mask
I don't
on.
think
You're either one person continuing to wear a mask. It'll be because of the mold in your house. Embrevale says, I agree with Ricardo. Current government is continuing with private housing development, but in fact, that is encouraging the construction of the wrong types of houses. There's a bunch of...
we just need more houses, right? This is, like all of the sort of ideal world thinking that we've been talking about, it all comes back to we need to build more houses, right? That seems to be one of the issues we keep falling back on. And it needs to be, as the viewer said, it needs to be quality houses that make sense, right? And putting the government money into these developers that, where that isn't a concern to them, just it doesn't seem right.
Gareth also asks more of a random question about the US Supreme Court stuff. I've been keeping a look. He asks us, I'll be keeping an eye on it. I've been keeping a little bit of an eye on it, to be honest with you, Gareth. But although I love US politics, since George and I have started doing this, I think this is week 4 we've been doing this, I'm spending 6 to 8 hours a day on this. So American politics might have been possibly my hobby in the past, and I loved it. Whilst I still keep an eye on it, I haven't been quite as involved as I was. But I do see that there are conservatives currently leaning on Manchin, I think his name is, the centrist Democrat, to try and vote against the Supreme Court nominee and questioning her her commitment to law and order. Fucking Supreme Court judge committed that. So I haven't kept an eye on it, Gareth, but I have to be honest, I haven't been following it too in depth, but I do love it. So yes, maybe you've inspired me to go and have a look at that today. Now, George, we missed out on Anton today because of ultimately internet connection. Do we have any kind of vibe as to when or if that's going to happen? It will happen, but do we know, is it a tomorrow thing? Is it a wait and see thing? Put it on the radar?
Yeah, so I think what we might need to do is some sort of pre-recording. Obviously, we can talk about this, but he is going to be leaving probably in a month. So there's still time to talk with him. So yeah, sorry, we won't have him tomorrow.
All right, no problems at all. And other than that, I think we're probably pretty much done for the day. Thank you for joining us today. There'll be a couple of clips coming up later on in the afternoon. Follow us at the YouTube channel, DOCNZ Studios. The reason it's a studio page is there's multiple content on there for different sources. I just mentioned Elephant TV. Why don't I bring up the page? Why don't I do that? Why don't I be like a professional and bring up the page and like just fucking show people, eh? Just like show people. So of course, when I try and do it, it doesn't work, does it?
Crazy Old World said US midterms coming to a shit show near you. I am looking forward to that, and definitely we will be across American politics when we're feeling the vibe. Because I did follow, for example, the Bernie campaign very closely, and the Democratic primaries that time around.
So this is the DOCNZ studio page, and you can see we're currently live. So this is what's happening right now. And then there's all the uploads that we've made. And then we have a section called the Department of Conversation, which is the podcast that I do. Spoke to Petra Baggis last week. Spoke to Paula Penfold this week, and that's coming out tomorrow morning. Paula Penfold about her latest documentary on Stuff Circuit. There's Department of Conversation clips, and this is Elephant TV. This is what I was just talking about. Affordable quality housing is a right. That's there. And then there's a section of big hairy news as well. And some other bits and bobs are in there that we put up there. So that's why it's a studio page, because as you can see up the top here, it's the home of Big Hairy News, home of the Department of Conversation, home of Elephant TV. It's a studio. Think of it as a Studio D, the Studio D page. And that's why that is. The other thing you can do is follow me on Twitter, because all of the clips that we make from our daily show goes up on Twitter as well. Alrighty, mighty. I think we're done, George. Now, tomorrow we are going to be delving back into that conversation we started. If it was yesterday, we put off yesterday because of the Prime Minister, which is how we consume our content. Be interested to know how you consume your content. If you have, like when I started to think what kind of subscriptions I have, I'm a little bit shocked, because in the house right now, I have Spotify, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime. I have a Sky subscription through my Vodafone, so it's inexpensive. I have Apple TV that came with my phone. So I'm up to 6 already without even thinking about. I'm the New York Times. I'm about to get the NZ Herald. And this isn't even subscriptions that, like, I must belong to subscriptions that help me put out podcasts, for example, technical ones as well. That's just all content. I'm up to 8 already before I go any further. God, I should go.
I think I contribute to one Patreon, and we use my girlfriend's brother's Netflix. And yeah, that's it.
Have you looked? They're going to put something in place to stop that? We should talk about that tomorrow.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know whether they're going to put on like link it to an ISP or something like that. But Netflix has announced account sharing, they called it. They're going to put a stop to it. I'm not sure how yet, but we should delve into that tomorrow and see what we can figure it out. The other thing, of course, without all of the subscriptions, I probably still consume most of my content free online.
Yeah.
So it's like 8 subscriptions, yet most of what I watch is free online. So there you go. All right, George. So that'll be tomorrow. Some other bits and bobs as well. I mean, I guess we're not going to have Anton, but we'll see when that happens. And
yeah, I think I've got a good substitute for Anton lined up anyway. So
actually,
keep
Tom
your
Much,
eyes peeled.
yeah, and Tom Much contacted me yesterday, who was our journalist in Ukraine, and so we've organised to have a chat with him either tonight or tomorrow morning. And so we'll be going into Ukraine tomorrow and having a chat with journalist Tom Much. He said to me yesterday when he messaged me, he's leaving the country. I'm not sure why yet, but we're going to kind of get his last interview before he leaves country. So Tom Much probably tomorrow, the conversation around how you consume your content. Feel free to join us online and tell us what you consume and how you consume it, and we'll have this chat tomorrow along with a bunch of other things as well. All right, team, you're all beautiful people. Thanks for joining us today. And until anon, hey nonny nonny. Catch you then. Hooroo.